Part 1. The Audit. The Reality. Check. You know, my daughter didn't actually raise that boy. She wasn't the one putting food on the table. She didn't stick up for him when things got tough, and she sure as heck never lost a wink of sleep over him. But funny how it works. The second he's worth $5.6 million, her memory clears right up and she suddenly remembers she's a mother. Look, I've been on this planet for 71 years. I raised an autistic child all by myself. I've lived through the lean years, the hard years, and the kind of dark times that would break most people. So, did she really think a woman in fancy heels and some guy in a three-piece suit were going to be the ones to take me down? She picked the wrong grandfather to mess with, I'll tell you that much. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Get your snacks, settle in, and just remember, the folks in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing. They just chose to go the other way. Drop a comment, hit that subscribe button, and stick around. You're gonna want to hear this. A quiet morning in Callaway. I want you to understand that I was having a perfectly decent day. Not a legendary one, just fine. When you're 71 years old living in Callaway, Arkansas, a good day basically means your knees don't sound like a pack of bubble wrap when you stand up, and your coffee stays hot long enough for you to actually drink it. That's the whole goal. I checked both boxes. I was just sitting there, watching the birds at the feeder Ethan Brooks built for my birthday. He's a smart kid, engineered it with a counterweight system so the squirrels couldn't get a free meal. He drew up the blueprints on a random Thursday like it was no big deal. I was sitting there thinking that, all things considered, life was doing all right. Then I heard a car pull into the gravel. It was a Lexus, silver with Arkansas plates, but it had that kind of showroom-clean look that tells you the owner doesn't actually spend much time in this state, or, if they do, they're in the parts of Arkansas that like to pretend they're somewhere else. The return. I knew who it was before the door even swung open. 11 years had passed, but I knew. She stepped out wearing a blazer in Callaway in the middle of September. It was 83 degrees out, and she showed up dressed like she was giving a corporate presentation on why she walked out on her kid. She had that specific look on her face, the one she'd use as a teenager when she'd broken something expensive and was already rehearsing the speech about why it wasn't her fault. It was retail grief, sympathy that looked practiced in a mirror. My daughter, Brianna Cole. I didn't budge from the porch. I just gripped my mug with both hands and waited. "Daddy," she said, all soft-like. "Lord, Brianna Cole," I replied. She walked up those porch steps like she still owned the place. She grew up here, sure, scraped her knees on these boards and took her prom photos against that railing. I've repainted that railing twice, mostly because Ethan Brooks used to peel the paint when he got anxious. I never stopped him. I just kept repainting it. Some battles aren't worth the breath, and at the end of the day, it's just paint. She looked at me like she expected a hug. I just looked at her like I was trying to solve a difficult math problem. "Can we talk?" she asked. "You're already talking," I said. "Might as well keep the momentum going." The work. She sat down at my kitchen table, which is basically Ethan Brooks's headquarters. It's covered in his notebooks, half-finished circuit boards, and those color-coded sticky notes I learned years ago never to move, not even by an inch. She talked for 20 minutes and managed to say absolutely nothing. She used words like healing and growth. She told me she'd been in therapy and had done the work. She said it just like that, like the work was some kind of brand-name product she'd bought off a shelf, and now she felt ready to have a relationship with her son. Her son. Let me stop right there so we're clear on something. Brianna Cole walked out when Ethan Brooks was 5. He'd just been officially diagnosed, though my late wife, Margaret Hayes, and I had seen the writing on the wall for 2 years. Brianna Cole was 27 at the time. She claimed she wasn't equipped. She said it wasn't fair to him to have a parent who couldn't give him what he needed. She wrapped her abandonment in the language of being unselfish, hopped in a Honda Civic, and drove away. She sent a Christmas card exactly once, back in 2017. It showed up in January of 2018, signed with her first name and nothing else. Ethan Brooks looked at it for a second, put it on the table, and went right back to his computer coding. He was 11. He'd already figured out she wasn't a variable worth including in his equations. So, while she sat there in her blazer talking about her son, I just sipped my coffee. I didn't throw it at her, which honestly stands as one of my proudest moments as a 71-year-old man. The truth comes out. "How is he?" she finally asked. 16, I told her. "He's smart, he's healthy, and he's doing good." "I saw the article," she said. There it was, the real reason. I set my cup down. "Did you now?" "Daddy, I'm proud of him," she said. "I want him to know that. I want to be involved." "Brianna Cole," I said, cutting her off. "What was the name of his third-grade teacher?" She just blinked at me. "What?" "His third-grade teacher," I repeated. "The one who called me in tears because Ethan Brooks was having a meltdown in the cafeteria, and she didn't know how to help him. I had to drive 40 minutes through a hailstorm to get to that school. What was her name?" Total silence. "Mrs. Patterson," I said. "Linda Carver. She retired back in 2022, and she still sends Ethan Brooks a card every single birthday, right on time. Now, you were saying something about being proud?" Brianna Cole left about 20 minutes later, claiming she just wanted to reconnect. She hugged me at the door, and I just let it happen, the same way you let a dentist do his work because you have to. The paperwork. 3 days later, the letter arrived. Thomas Reed has been my lawyer and my buddy since 1987. We used to play softball together until his hip and my knees went on strike. He's an honest man with the kind of face that physically cannot tell a lie. And that's usually a good thing in a friend. But it was a real problem when he looked up from that letter, looked me in the eye, and said, "Walter Hayes, she might actually have a case here." I stared at him. "Explain that to me real slow, Pete. Use small words, because I need to make sure I don't have a stroke right here in your office." He laid it out for me. Brianna Cole had never legally given up her parental rights. I'd raised Ethan Brooks on love, habit, and necessity, but the paperwork was the kind you keep in a kitchen drawer, not a courtroom. But here's the thing about people who think they can just walk back into a life they abandoned. They usually forget that the person they left behind isn't the only one who grew up. This is where the story gets real. It turns out having a genius under your roof is a lot more complicated than just bragging rights at the hardware store. Part 2. The Pattern, the Legal Loophole. Pete didn't have good news. There was no formal guardianship, no court-ordered transfer of power, nothing. On paper, I was just a grandpa who had stepped up because it was the right thing to do. But Ethan Brooks was still a minor, and those earnings from the sale of his app, all $5.6 million of it, were technically the assets of a child. Since Brianna Cole was his legal parent, she had standing. I drove home without even turning on the radio. I sat in my driveway for a good 10 minutes before I could even face the front door. When I finally walked in, Ethan Brooks was at the kitchen table. He had his headphones on and 3 different monitors glowing, looking at code that probably would have taken me 4 years just to read, let alone understand. I sat down across from him. He pulled his headphones down, which was his way of saying he already knew something was up. Ethan Brooks reads a room the same way most people read a book with large print. He does it easily, he does it completely, and he does it a hell of a lot faster than you'd expect. "Pete says she might actually win this," I told him. "I'm not the kind of man who finds it easy to say hard things. My late wife, Margaret Hayes, used to say I processed my emotions the way an old truck handles a freezing morning. Slow to start, required a few tries, but I'd eventually get where I was going. With Ethan Brooks, though, I'd learned to just say it plain. No hidden meanings, no beating around the bush, just the facts." He looked at me for a long beat. Then he looked back at his screen. Then, very quietly, he said 5 words I'll probably hear in the back of my head for the rest of my life. "Just let her talk, Pop." "Ethan Brooks, I'm the one handling this," I said, but he'd already put his headphones back on. The smartest person in the room, I'll be honest with you. My first reaction wasn't confidence. It was that specific kind of terror you feel when you're 71 and you realize the 16-year-old in front of you might be the smartest person in the room. It's a disorienting feeling. It's the kind of feeling that makes you want to sit down and eat something just to feel grounded. I made us both some grilled cheese. While he typed away, I sat there thinking about how I'd been trusting this kid's instincts since he was 9 years old. Back then, he told me the water heater was about to blow before it even leaked a drop. He'd noticed a specific sound pattern in the pipes and explained it meant the pressure was inconsistent. He was right, of course. I didn't know whether to fix the heater or call a talent scout. He'd never been wrong about a pattern. Not once. So, I finished my sandwich and decided to trust him. I still called Pete, though. I told him, find every scrap of paper we've got and start building a file. Trusting Ethan Brooks didn't mean I was going to sit on my hands. The boy got his grit from somewhere. The bridge builder. What Brianna Cole didn't get, and what her high-priced Little Rock lawyer Sandra Pruitt definitely didn't get, was that they were dealing with the kid who built SynPath. Ethan Brooks didn't build that app because he wanted to be a millionaire. To be honest, I don't think he even grasped what $5.6 million looks like in the real world. When the buyout offer came in, he didn't ask about cars or houses. He handed a typed note to Pete that said, "Is this enough to pay for Pop's retirement and fund 3 more years of development?" Pete actually had to step out into the hallway for a minute to pull himself together after reading that. Ethan Brooks built SynPath because he spent his whole childhood watching nonverbal kids get misunderstood. He watched them get labeled as difficult, dismissed by teachers, or just shoved aside. He'd been one of those kids himself early on. He knew, because I'd made sure he knew, that the kids weren't the problem. The problem was that nobody had built the right bridge for them to cross. So he built it himself. The app used pattern recognition and AI to help nonverbal kids talk to their parents and teachers in real time. It had 340,000 users in just over a year. It made the bigwigs in Silicon Valley cry during the pitch, which Ethan Brooks did via a recorded video because he had zero interest in flying to California. The CEO of the company that bought it called me up later and said, "Mr. Booker, your grandson is something else." "Yes," I told him, "he sure is." The gap. The thing about SynPath is that it required Ethan Brooks to understand communication down to the bone. He studied how people say things, how they avoid saying things, and that massive gap between what someone says and what they actually mean. He'd spent his life studying that gap. He watched normal people talk in circles, perform their feelings, and build these fake little stories for themselves. He'd become an expert at finding the truth buried under all that noise. So, when Brianna Cole started texting him, he started responding. I didn't know about it at first. He told me the whole story later, after the dust had settled, explaining it to me like a patient professor talking to a slow student. And, in this case, I definitely was the slow one. Her first text was, "Ethan Brooks, it's your mom. I hope this is okay. I just want you to know I'm thinking of you, and I love you." He waited 3 hours. Then he replied, "Hi, how did you get this number?" She told him my number was listed and she'd gotten his from a mutual contact. He just said okay and left it at that. She texted again 2 days later. He kept his replies slow and brief, but just warm enough to keep her talking. Then he started asking his own questions. "What do you remember about me when I was little?" She sent back some vague nonsense about him being curious and bright, generic stuff, the kind of thing you'd say about a kid you saw in a movie once. Then he asked, "What was my favorite food when I was 5?" There was a long pause. Then, "I remember you liked pasta. Now Ethan Brooks likes pasta now. But at 5? He wouldn't touch the stuff. The texture drove him crazy. At 5 years old, that boy ate exactly 4 things: rice, scrambled eggs, apple slices with the peel cut off, and a specific brand of crackers I had to drive all the way to Fort Smith to get because our local Walmart stopped carrying them. I can still see the look on his face when I'd walk in with 3 boxes of those crackers. That's a memory I'm taking to the grave with me. Brianna Cole, on the other hand, was already failing the test, and she didn't even know she was taking it. Part 3. The Audit, the Paper Trail. Brianna Cole had no idea what she was walking into. At one point, Ethan Brooks texted her a simple question. "Why did you decide to come back now?" Her answer, and I want you to really let this sink in, was, "I saw what you built, and I realized I couldn't keep letting fear keep me from my son." She didn't say she saw him. She didn't say she realized she missed the boy he'd become. She saw what he built. It was about the acquisition, plain and simple. Ethan Brooks didn't get angry. He just screenshotted every single word. Then, without telling me, he set up a meeting with Pete. I only found out about it after the fact. He walked into that law office and handed Pete a 14-page document. It was every text and every voicemail transcript, all laid out in order, with notes in the margins explaining exactly what each message revealed about her true motives. The kid had even color-coded the annotations. Pete called me that night sounding a little humbled. "Walter Hayes," he said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For even suggesting for a second that you might lose." "The claims adjuster." Now, I'm not a tech wizard. I can't build an app. Heck, I can barely update my phone without yelling for Ethan Brooks. But I am a 71-year-old man who spent 34 years working as a county claims adjuster. If that job teaches you anything, it's how to find the things people try to bury. I started making some calls of my own. I looked into Brianna Cole's husband, Marcus Doyle. I'd only met the man twice, and both times he gave me one of those handshakes that feels more like an aggressive announcement than a greeting. Turns out Marcus Doyle was drowning. His contracting business over in Fayetteville had 3 outstanding liens, a lawsuit from a subcontractor, and a loan restructure filed in the Benton County Civil Court. It's all public record if you know where to look. A morning spent on a computer told the whole story. Brianna Cole's return wasn't about grief turning into courage. It was just math. But what really got to me, the thing that made me lean back and just close my eyes, was the social media stuff. I don't use it myself. I think it's just paying for the privilege of being watched. But my neighbor, Sharon Mills, lives for that stuff, and she's got a real heart for justice. I mentioned the situation over the fence, and by the next morning, she had Brianna Cole's entire Facebook profile printed out. 11 years of posts. Her wedding to Marcus Doyle in 2019. Vacations, fancy dinners, her wellness journey, the works. Ethan Brooks didn't appear once. Not a single photo, not a thinking of my son post, nothing. For over a decade, her son didn't exist to the world. That is, until September 14th, 2024, exactly 2 days after the news broke that Ethan Brooks's app had been bought for millions. Suddenly, she's posting, "So proud of my son's incredible achievement. He's always been exceptional. A mother's heart is so full." She got 47 likes. One person even commented, "The apple doesn't fall far." I just shook my head. Day of reckoning. The hearing was on a Thursday. Judge Diane Whitaker was presiding. I wore the same suit I'd worn to my wife, Margaret Hayes' funeral. It's the only one I have, and honestly, I felt like Margaret Hayes needed to be there for this. Pete was as calm as a Sunday morning. Ever since he saw Ethan Brooks's 14-page breakdown, he had that look of a man who knows exactly what cards he's holding. Brianna Cole showed up in a sharp charcoal suit, accompanied by her lawyer, Sandra Pruitt, the kind of woman who walks like she's already won and charges $450 an hour just to prove it. Sandra had a fancy leather binder with tabs. I had a USB drive. Pete had a plain old banker's box. Ethan Brooks stayed home. He told me the hearing didn't require him, and I didn't argue. I've never forced that boy into a space that didn't need him. He just made me a thermos of coffee, set it by my keys, and went back to his screens. When Judge Sims walked in, I took a breath and thought, Margaret Hayes, this is for both of us. You did the first 5 years, I did the next 11. Let's finish this. The performance, Sandra Pruitt opened up with a performance I have to admit was impressive. She talked about parental rights and informal arrangements. She used the phrase mental health challenges to do a lot of heavy lifting for the word abandonment. She painted a picture of a woman who had finally healed and just wanted to be involved in her minor son's life and, of course, help manage his substantial financial assets. She was careful. She never said she wanted the money. She just said she wanted appropriate parental involvement in asset management. It was the same thing, just with better lighting. Judge Sims didn't say a word. She just watched. Then she asked if Brianna Cole wanted to speak. Pete looked at me, and I just shook my head. Let her talk. Brianna Cole stood up, and she was good. She'd clearly practiced. She cried right on cue. Not too early, just at the perfect emotional moment. She talked about being overwhelmed and not equipped, and about her journey of self-discovery. It was a solid 6-minute performance. The real test. When she finished, Judge Sims looked at her over the top of her glasses. Miss Pruitt, she said, I'd like to ask your client a few questions directly. Sandra started to stand up. Your Honor, my client. Your client is a grown adult asking this court for legal and financial authority over a child, Sims said, her voice pleasant but firm. I'd like to hear from her. Please, sit. Sandra sat. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead and fought the urge to smile. Brianna Cole, the judge began, can you describe Ethan Brooks's primary sensory sensitivities? How does his daily routine accommodate them? The silence was deafening. Take your time, the judge added. He needs quiet, Brianna Cole stammered. He doesn't like loud places. Specifics, the judge pushed. What does he eat? What are his sleep patterns? How does he communicate when he's under extreme stress? More silence. Brianna Cole looked over at her lawyer, but Sandra couldn't help her. Nobody could. You can't study for a test that requires 11 years of being present. I haven't been able to be involved, Brianna Cole whispered. That's why I'm here. Who attended his IEP meetings? Judge Sims asked. His what? His individualized education program, the judge said. The meeting every year where teachers and specialists sit down with the parent to discuss the child's learning plan. Who was there for those? I felt the shift in the room right then. It wasn't about law anymore. It was about the truth that had been sitting in that kitchen for over a decade. This is where the long game finally met the finish line. When you play for keeps, you'd better make sure you actually know the rules of the game you're playing. Brianna Cole didn't. Part 4. The Reckoning. The Empty Chair. I'd been to every single one of those IEP meetings. Every year, from kindergarten right up until Ethan Brooks decided he was done with the traditional school system at 14, and we switched to a private tutor he actually clicked with. Brianna Cole just sat there, blank-faced. She didn't even know what the letters IEP stood for. I watched the judge make a slow, deliberate note on her pad. You could practically hear the ink hitting the paper. Tell me about SynPath, Judge Sims said, shifting gears. Explain to me exactly what it does. Brianna Cole perked up a bit. She thought she was back on solid ground, the kind of stuff she could marketing speak her way through. It's a communication app for children, she said, sounding hopeful. It's been very successful, and Ethan Brooks obviously has a real gift. And how does it work, exactly? The judge pushed. It helps kids talk to their parents, Brianna Cole replied. Judge Sims didn't even look up. It uses adaptive pattern recognition to build individualized communication profiles for nonverbal users, integrating with standard AAC frameworks. It doesn't just help kids talk to parents generally. It builds a unique language bridge for every single user. Your son built it specifically because the standard tools weren't smart enough for kids with highly specific sensory needs." The judge paused, letting that sit in the air. "I made it a point to read up on the tech when this case was filed. I thought I should actually know what we were talking about here." She looked Brianna Cole dead in the eye. "Did you even try the product before you showed up today?" Brianna Cole didn't say a word. The answer was written all over her face in a font big enough for the back row to read. The paper trail. That's when Pete stood up. He moved with the kind of ease a man has when he knows he's already won. He started laying it out. 11 years of school records. My signature on every single form, every conference, every doctor's visit. My name was the only one in the emergency contact box. Below it, in the secondary field, it just said, Ethan Brooks's grandfather. No other name was ever listed. Then came the tax records. Brianna Cole and Marcus Doyle had been filing jointly for 11 years, and for every single one of those years, they'd claimed 0 dependents. On penalty of perjury, she had told the United States government for over a decade that she wasn't supporting a child. She'd signed her name to that lie every April. I saw Sandra Pruitt, Brianna Cole's high-priced lawyer, start scribbling on her legal pad. She didn't look like she was planning a victory dinner anymore. Ethan Brooks's words. "Your Honor," Pete said, "I'd like to enter a series of texts between the petitioner and the child into evidence, along with a sworn statement from Ethan Brooks Walter Hayes Booker himself." He wrote it in his own words, at his own request. Pete handed over a USB drive and the printed statement. The courtroom got so quiet I could hear the clerk's pen scratching. Judge Sims read that statement for what felt like an eternity. I sat there counting my own breaths just to keep steady. I'd read it the night before. Ethan Brooks had slid it across the kitchen table to me without saying a word, then went back to his laptop so I could have some privacy while I processed it. I had to go to the bathroom and splash cold water on my face after I finished it. He wrote about the secret knock I always do on his door. 3 short, a pause, then 2 short. We'd worked that out when he was 7 because he needed to know exactly who was on the other side of the door before it opened. He wrote about those specific crackers I used to hunt down in Fort Smith. But the part that got me, the part I didn't even know he'd noticed, was about Margaret Hayes's final year. He wrote about how I was juggling her illness and his needs all at once. He was only 9, but he'd started making me tea every morning without being asked. He wrote that he'd noticed my cortisol indicators were high, and he'd read that warm liquids helped. He said it was the only variable he felt he could control to help me. My 9-year-old was taking care of me because he was worried I was breaking down. He wrote that he built SynPath because of a boy he saw in therapy when he was 11, a kid who had a world of things to say but no way to say them. Ethan Brooks saw it as an engineering problem, and he wrote that the only reason he had the time to solve that problem was because I had organized his world so carefully that he always had the luxury of time to think. The final word. Judge Sims set the paper down. She looked at Brianna Cole, and I noticed my daughter had finally stopped performing. The grief on her face was real now, but it wasn't the kind you feel when you miss someone. It was the grief of a person realizing that something they wanted had just drifted out of reach forever. "The petition for reinstatement of parental authority is denied," Sims said. Sandra Pruitt didn't even flinch. Professionals handle losing differently than the rest of us. Brianna Cole, though, let out a small, broken sound. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I am granting formal, permanent legal guardianship to Walter Hayes Elias Booker. This should have been settled years ago, and frankly, it's a gap in our system that it wasn't. Mr. Booker, work with your attorney to get the paperwork finalized." Then she looked back at Brianna Cole's tax files. "I'm also referring these 11 years of dependent filings to the revenue authorities for a full review. That isn't punitive. It's just procedure." She said it as casually as if she were talking about the weather. The walk out. The court adjourned. Sandra Pruitt had her binder under her arm and was halfway to the exit before Brianna Cole even stood up. I just sat there for a second. Pete put a hand on my shoulder, but I told him I needed a minute. I thought about Margaret Hayes. I thought about sitting at that same kitchen table when Ethan Brooks was 3, right after the diagnosis when we were both terrified. I remembered her hand on mine saying, "We'll figure it out." I felt a sting in my chest thinking about how she didn't get to see the bird feeder, or the app, or that statement he wrote. But then again, maybe she did. I think she would have handled today by crying in the car for 5 minutes, then going home to cook a massive meal and acting like it was just another Tuesday. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and walked out into the Arkansas afternoon. It was warm, quiet, and smelled like the first hint of fall. It felt like a good day to go home and have a hot cup of coffee with my grandson. And that's the thing about family. Sometimes the people who share your blood are just strangers with a claim, but the people who stay, they're the ones who write the story. Most folks think revenge is supposed to be loud, like some big, dramatic speech in a movie where the hero slams the door and the music swells. But that's just Hollywood. In the real world, revenge is actually pretty quiet. It's the low, steady sound of the right outcome finally pulling into the driveway after you've been waiting in the dark for a long time. Part 5. The Engineering Solution. The Victory Dinner. After we left the courthouse, I didn't go out to celebrate. I just drove home. I stopped by the Brookshires on the way and picked up the ingredients for pasta, the very specific kind Ethan Brooks likes. It's a recipe we spent about 3 years negotiating until the texture and the sauce were exactly right. You won't find it in any cookbook, but in this house, it's the gold standard. We sat at the kitchen table just like we always do. His notebooks were spread out, his monitors were glowing, and I could tell he'd been deep in some new project all day. There's a specific frequency to his silence when he's focused. It's different from his other silences. I couldn't explain the math of it to you, but I could recognize it in a pitch-black room. "She lost," I told him, keeping it simple. "I know," he said, not looking up. "Pete sent me a text." We ate for a minute before I added, "That tax referral thing, that was a real sharp move by Pete." Ethan Brooks didn't say a word. He just let the corner of his mouth twitch into a tiny half-smile. I stared at him. That boy. It wasn't Pete's idea at all. The transaction. I didn't find out about the retirement account until a Saturday morning about 3 weeks later. I was sitting on the porch with my first cup of coffee when a notification popped up on my phone. I had to read it 3 times. You know that feeling when your brain just refuses to accept what your eyes are seeing? $200,000 had been transferred into my account. In the little memo field where the bank lets you write a note, he'd typed, "For Walter Hayes. He knows why." The next morning, I found a physical sticky note on my coffee maker. I have no idea when he put it there or how he managed to do it without waking me up. He's 16 and I'm 71. And apparently, stealth is a skill set he's been practicing behind my back. The note was just 3 words. For showing up. I stood there in my kitchen, wearing my old robe and socks at 6 in the morning, holding that little yellow piece of paper. I thought about how this kid once couldn't even speak, and now he's building bridges for other children to find their way out of the silence. I thought about how he'd quietly dismantled his own mother's legal case with 14 color-coded pages and 6 weeks of playing the long game. I thought about him making me tea when he was 9 years old because he was worried about my stress levels. I stood there for a good long while. Then I finished my coffee, walked out to the porch, and watched the birds. Squirrels and engineering. Out in the yard, a squirrel was sitting at the base of the bird feeder Ethan Brooks built for me, the one with the counterweight mechanism. The squirrel looked absolutely baffled. It was furious, trying the same jump for the 4th time and getting the same result every single time. It struck me right then. Some problems are just engineering problems. And some people? Well, some people are just squirrels who never figured that out. Brianna Cole's appeal finally came through in February. Sandra Pruitt was nothing if not thorough, but it was shot down pretty quick. As for the tax review, Pete told me, with a very professional neutral tone, that the penalties and back payments ended up costing her a lot more than the money she came here looking for. She hasn't reached out since. Ethan Brooks hasn't asked about her either. As I'm writing this, he's 3 months deep into his next project. He won't tell me what it is yet, but he showed me a diagram last Friday that I stared at for a full minute before admitting I didn't have the slightest clue what I was looking at. He just nodded patiently. He's used to me being a few steps behind. He'll tell me when it's ready. Until then, I'll be right here on the porch. Walter Hayes Elias Booker still lives in Callaway, Arkansas, with his grandson, Ethan Brooks. He likes his coffee hot, and his knees are still loud, and honestly, he's perfectly fine with both of those things. If you appreciated this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, family-centered stories. Thanks for sticking around and being part of the journey.